So this is my presentation for the Words Matter project, and I analyze the source Parliament debates the Stamp Act from the perspective of George Grenfell. This is my trailer I made for the source. So yeah, that's basically a little snapshot of what the source we're going to be covering. So you may be wondering what Parliament is based off of what you saw in the trailer. So Parliament is a legislative body in England made up of three main branches, basically. It's the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarchy. And the House of Commons and the House of Lords are the most prominent parts of Parliament. Basically, what they do is they're checking the government, creating and revising laws, basically keeping just everything working and making sure there's no biases. And they debate important issues facing the UK, as well as approve the budget, taxes, and monitor government spending, anything having to do with money. Some context about this time period is it's in 1765, it's 2 years after the French and Indian War had ended, and Britain was in major debt because Britain had to put more soldiers in the colonies in order to gain a victory. Full-time soldiers had to stay in the colonies after the war was over in order to prevent crimes from the Native American communities. The soldiers also had to attempt to keep peace between the French and the natives. The British monarchy decided to pay off their debt by taxing the colonists extra on common goods with the Stamp Act, which infuriated Americans. For so long, Britain had practiced a period of salutary neglect with the colonies, in which Britannica describes as, quote, trade regulations for the colonies were laxly enforced and imperial supervision of internal colonial affairs was loose, as long as the colonies remained loyal to the British government and contributed to economic profitability of Britain. When Britain all of a sudden started to become more possessive over the colonies, citizens were confused about the sudden change and they didn't like it. As a result, to escape the massive bummer of an economic situation, the Stamp Act was enacted, which required colonists to pay a tax represented by a stamp on different forms of paper products, such as documents, newspapers, playing cards, and dice. The speaker of this piece is George Grenfell. He is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, as well as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. Grenfell was in charge of taking a vote on the Stamp Act on behalf of the British government. He started in Parliament in 1741 and quickly rose to become the Prime Minister for King George III. He was rough with American taxation and ruled with a lack of enthusiasm. His love of taxation, especially with the Sugar and Stamp Act, started frustration in the colonies, which would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Grenfell's purpose with his speech during the debate was to inform the committee and the American people on why the Stamp Act is necessary. Grenfell is speaking to Parliament during the debate, so it's not as much convincing them as it is discussing why the Stamp Act is necessary, but he does have to get votes on his side. When he says, quote, the reason of the delaying the proposal to this year was to gain all possible information to give Americans an opportunity of conveying information to this House. Ears are always open and to receive knowledge and to act to it, helps to portray England as a country that's always wanting the best for their colonies. He wants the other committee members to believe that England has consistently been a positive voice for the colonies and that America has more say in policies than they actually did, so they would think, oh, like, we've done a lot for them, so they have to pay us back in some way with the Stamp Act and with the extra taxation on them. Grenville's intended audience was, of course, the people who were physically present at the committee of the House of Commons, who were there to participate in the debate, who he wanted to get on his side for the votes. But I think in a way Grenville also wanted to spread his message to all the colonists about how taxes are mandatory as part of the British colonies, as well as explaining why he needed to tax them. He wanted to ease his audience's minds with this speech so they're less likely to revolt. His audience in that way being the colonists. In case that the colonists do revolt, he has a stern warning for them that says, when he says, quote, "Forgery is the only fright to be apprehended, but severe penalties may prevent it. The punishment is in this country death." The spark that made Grenville stand up and speak his mind was when England started to realize how much keeping permanent soldiers in the Americas was going to cost. Keep peace between the French and Indians was a big enough task, but the soldiers also had to, quote, "deal with smuggling, land grabbing, and crime." As mentioned before, the French and Indian War put England in quite a bit more debt than they expected, so they needed a quick way to get that money back. Parliament needed to vote on the Stamp Act rapidly in order for it to become permanent. Grenville probably figured that most people in the room would favor the act since most of them were rich and didn't live in America, and in that way they didn't affect them at all. Some choices that Grenville made throughout his speech is that he understands the fact that the new law would not be well received. He obviously knows that. As a result, he brings up objections that the other committee members or just the colonists in general might have, and then he rebuts them. For example, he says, quote, "Objection, they have no representation here." Answer, "Parliament represents all, as well as non-electors as electors. Not a 20th part of England represented, not the great body of merchants, not the East Indian Company possessed of such territories." He also uses a comparison of other countries and how they tax to further promote this point. He says, quote, "No more does the West like the cider tax, Scotland the beer tax, the middle of England the land tax. The interest of all was mutual. By bringing in other countries and the taxes that they pay, it proves his point that America isn't the only place being taxed in the world." He also uses the strategy of rhetorical questions to invoke thinking within the committee. For example, quote, "When will the time come when enforcing a tax will not give discontent if the tax does produce it after what we have done and suffered for America?" This rhetorical question makes the committee members think about how England has been useful to the colonies with little payback. This will make them more likely to vote on the Stamp Act because they feel that America needs to pull some weight. One of George Grenville's most used appeals was the logical appeal. He used this with his statistics about how the prices of troops in America have changed. He says, quote, "The Navy used to cost about 7 or 800,000 euros. Now it costs 1.4 million euros. Money for these expenses must be raised somewhere. However, contributors will be displeased. That this great increase of the Navy is incurred in a great measure of service of North America." This is a useful appeal as it lays out the straight facts for the members of the committee. Hearing the numbers can cause them to understand better why Britain is making these decisions. Grenville also uses numbers and facts to explain that the colonies aren't the only people paying taxes and that their debt is a lot more than originally thought. He says, quote, "The whole of North America consists perhaps of 16 or 1700,000 inhabitants, pay only about 64,000 euros a year for its establishment, except North Carolina and Maryland, which he has not been able to get at. West Indies establishment amounts to about 77,000 euros. The debts of North America, except Pennsylvania, of which he has not given an account, amounted to 848,000 euros. It didn't amount to 2 million euros. Grenville also utilizes emotional appeals in a way to guilt-trip the members of the committee to vote on the Stamp Act. The quote, "We have expended so much on the support and the defense of North America. We have given them so great a degree of security after they were before in continual wars." Grenville has to know that it will be difficult to pass this act, so emotional quotes like these help to keep his argument together, as well as, again, guilt-trip people into thinking how much resources England has spent on the colonies, how they've supported North America through its wars, and how they have protected them. Throughout his speech, and even in a bit of rebuttal, Grenville maintains a pretty calm, formal tone. Through reading his speech, we can infer that he didn't raise his voice, but rather presented the facts and had them stand. A great example of this is when he says, quote, "The particular propriety of this mode of raising tax, objection that this tax will produce disturbance and discontent and prevent improvement among the colonies. He has no motive, he can have no motive for taxing a colony, but that of doing his duty." This quote could have easily been a lot more, fiery and, debatable, like, getting into it and, calling people out and, maybe cussing and, like, when it gets into, like, fiery debates, it could, like, the tone of the speech could have gotten a lot more, like, upbeat, but instead we can infer based off a bit of the context around the speech that Grenville was pretty calm and that he was there. He knew what his job was. He wanted to get the votes. He just wanted to get his speech out of the way, rebut the people he needed to rebut so that he could get these votes and move on. Grenville's speech to Parliament can best be summed up as an effort to get other members of his side to support. During the speech, he laid out specific reasons for why he thinks the Stamp Act is necessary, as well as defended the idea that England doesn't listen to the colonies. He gives examples of multiple countries in which taxation occurs and even lays out how in debt the colonies are in order to best put everything into perspective. His main idea can best be described by this quote: "All colonies are subject to the dominion of the mother country, whether they are a colony of the freest or most absolute government." This wraps up the idea that Britain has the right to tax the colonies because they're under British rule, which is the biggest point he makes during his argument. Another big point consistently made by Grenville is, quote, "The propriety and expedience of laying this tax, first with respect to the state of the country, second with respect to the state of America, with exemptions will go to. The western country desires an exemption from cider, the northern from a duty on beer, the mischief from the 4 shillings land tax. The true way to relieve all is to make all contribute their proper share." This excerpt from the speech demonstrates that the purpose of this tax is to help both England and America. This part also explains that the only way to alleviate the land tax, as well as to not pay taxes on cider and beer, is to do the Stamp Act. Basically, Grenville's main point with this quote is that money has to come in from somewhere. Britain can't just pay for everything. The colonists have to contribute as well. These are my MLA citations.